A young black girl stands barefoot at a bus stop, clutching a pair of high heels too big for her. Across the street, a black sedan lurks, its driver watching her every move. Shaq notices. Something isn't right. But when she suddenly runs, instincts take over. He follows. And what he uncovers forces him to make a call that will change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The afternoon sun glared down on the city, reflecting off car hoods and shop windows. The streets pulsed with life. Cars honking, conversations spilling onto sidewalks, music thumping from open windows. It was just another busy day in the heart of the city, but for Big Shaq, something felt off. He had been driving through town, just running a few errands, when the red light caught him. He barely paid attention to traffic stops, usually lost in thought about his charity work, his business, or just life in general. But today, his focus locked in on something unusual. At the bus stop on the corner, standing alone, was a young black girl, barefoot. Shaq's brow furrowed. She was gripping a pair of red high heels, holding them so tightly that her knuckles were pale. The shoes were too big for her. Much too big. They dangled awkwardly from her fingers, a stark contrast against her frail frame. She wasn't waiting for the bus like the others. She wasn't scrolling through a phone, wasn't chatting with anyone. She just stood there, stiff, her body drawn tight as if bracing for something unseen. Shaq shifted in his seat. Something about her eyes unsettled him. They were wide, darting around as though she expected someone or something to appear at any second. She was scared. He rolled his window down, the city air thick with gasoline, hot pavement, and the distant scent of fried food from a food truck parked nearby. He didn't say anything at first, just watched. She looked too young to be this afraid, maybe 13, 14 at most. Her clothes were simple, jeans, a faded hoodie that had seen better days, but her feet were bare, resting uneasily on the hot pavement. Shaq's gut clenched. He had been around long enough, seen enough darkness in the world, to know when something wasn't right. A black sedan sat parked across the street. The windows were tinted, but from the slight crack in the driver's window, Shaq caught the faint curl of cigarette smoke drifting into the air. The man inside wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't moving like he was waiting for someone. He was watching her. Shaq turned back to the girl. She clutched the heels even tighter, knuckles whitening. Something was very, very wrong. The light turned green. A horn blared behind him. Shaq didn't move. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. The girl shifted slightly, her head turning a fraction of an inch, just enough for her to glance at the car across the street. Shaq's stomach dropped. She wasn't waiting for a bus. She wasn't lost. She was trapped. Shaq grabbed his phone, dialing 911 with practiced ease. He had donated to the police department, attended charity events with city officials, hell, even worked on initiatives for missing kids. But now it wasn't about funding or awareness. This was real. 911. What's your emergency? Shaq's voice came out low, firm. I got a situation. Young black girl, maybe 13 or 14, standing at a bus stop, barefoot, clutching high heels. She looks terrified. His eyes flicked back to the black sedan. There's a car watching her. Black sedan, tinted windows. Driver hasn't moved. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. Can you confirm if she's in immediate danger? Shaq's jaw tightened. If I wait until I can confirm it, it might be too late. A pause. Then, stay on the line. Shaq lowered the phone slightly, keeping it on speaker as he watched the girl. The bus was approaching now, its brakes hissing as it pulled up. The other commuters started shifting, pulling out their transit cards, preparing to board. The girl didn't move. She wasn't waiting for the bus. And then, she ran. Shaq barely had time to react. She turned on her heel and bolted, not toward the bus, but away from it. Away from the car. Away from something. The black sedan's engine roared to life. Shaq's heart kicked up. He couldn't just sit there. Without thinking, without planning, he threw his SUV into drive and followed her. She weaved through the crowd, her small frame darting between people, dodging strollers and briefcases. Shaq kept his distance, driving slow enough not to draw attention, but fast enough that he wouldn't lose her. The sedan was doing the same. Shaq's pulse pounded in his ears. She turned sharply into an alley. The sedan hesitated, then sped off. Shaq pulled over, his big hands gripping the wheel. His mind raced. Had the driver given up? Or did he just know something Shaq didn't? He took a deep breath and made a decision. He wasn't walking away from this. Throwing open his door, Shaq stepped onto the sidewalk, the city noise wrapping around him. He took a few careful steps toward the alley, his heart hammering in his chest. Nia, he called gently, though he had no idea why that name had come to him. Maybe he had heard it somewhere. Maybe it was intuition. No answer. Shaq took another step. Then he saw her. She was crouched behind a dumpster, her chest rising and falling fast, her small hands clutching the high heels like a lifeline. She looked up, her eyes full of pure, raw fear. And that's when Shaq noticed it. The black band around her ankle, not a bracelet, not jewelry, a tracker. His stomach dropped. He knelt down, his voice low. Calm. Safe. Hey, it's all right. You're safe. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Shaq felt it then, the weight of what this meant. She wasn't just some lost girl. She had been taken. And whoever had taken her, they weren't done. Shaq didn't move at first. His hand still gripped the wheel, his foot hovering over the gas pedal, his mind locking in on one thought. She ran, not toward the bus, not toward safety, away. Shaq's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't normal. A lost kid might hesitate, might be confused. But this was fear, the kind you don't just see, you feel. And Shaq felt it deep. His eyes flicked to the black sedan across the street. The driver hadn't moved. The cigarette still burned at his fingers, curling smoke drifting through the cracked window. But Shaq saw it. The shift. The man had been watching her, and the second she ran, his entire body tensed. Shaq grabbed his phone, his fingers already dialing. 911, what's your emergency? His voice was low, firm. There's a girl, young, black, maybe 13, 14. She was standing at a bus stop, barefoot, clutching high heels, looked scared. The second I tried to talk to her, she ran. His jaw tightened. And there's a car, black sedan. Driver's been watching her, just sitting there. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. Can you confirm if she's in immediate danger? Shaq's gaze snapped back to the alley where the girl had disappeared. His gut told him everything he needed to know. If I wait to confirm, it might be too late. A pause. Then, stay on the line. Shaq didn't answer. He was already out of the car. The air hit him thick and hot, the smell of asphalt and gasoline mixing with the scent of street food lingering in the distance. But he barely noticed. He crossed the street in long strides, his entire body tensed. He wasn't a cop, wasn't a hero, but he wasn't about to let this slide. The sedan didn't move. The driver pretended not to notice him, but Shaq wasn't stupid. He knew when a man was sizing him up. Shaq ignored him, his focus locked on the girl's last known direction. The alley. It was narrow, wedged between a convenience store and a closed-down laundromat. A broken streetlight cast jagged shadows against the brick walls, turning the passageway into a darkened tunnel. Shaq stepped inside, his massive frame nearly brushing both sides. A flicker of movement. A rustle near the dumpster. Shaq's voice dropped, calm but commanding. Lil sis, you there? Silence. Then, a tiny shuffle. Shaq took another step, and there she was. She was crouched behind a dumpster, her small frame pressed into the corner. The high heels were still clutched in her hands, her fingers so tight around them that her knuckles had turned white. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in fast, panicked bursts. Shaq held up his hands. You're safe. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you. She flinched. Shaq's gut twisted. I ain't a cop, he said carefully. Ain't with nobody. Just want to make sure you good. Her eyes darted past him. Not at him, past him. Shaq's blood ran cold. A sound behind him. Heavy boots, slow steps. Shaq turned, his breath steady, his heartbeat not. Two men stood at the entrance of the alley, dressed clean, too clean for this neighborhood. Suits, like they had just walked out of a business meeting. But their faces, cold, empty, and worst of all, unbothered. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair, smiled. It wasn't friendly. "She with you?" Shaq didn't answer. The shorter one, stockier, took a step forward. "We'll take her from here." Shaq's jaw locked. He turned slightly, positioning himself between them and the girl. "She don't look like she want to go with you." The taller one's smile never faded. "You don't know who we are." Shaq's breath was steady, but his muscles coiled like a spring. He'd been in enough locker rooms, enough boardrooms, enough backroom negotiations to know the scent of power when he was breathing it in. But this wasn't corporate. This wasn't business. This was dirtier, darker. And these men? They weren't used to being told no. The stocky one took another step. Shaq shifted his stance just slightly, planting himself firmly. Tall one raised an eyebrow. "Think carefully." Mr. O'Neill Shaq didn't flinch, but his blood chilled. They knew who he was. The slick-haired man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like Shaq was a rookie who had fumbled a play. "You think money makes you untouchable?" His voice was almost amused. "We own this city." Shaq didn't blink. "Funny, 'cause I ain't never seen y'all at no meetings." A flicker of irritation, then it was gone, replaced with that same cold amusement. "Last chance," the taller one murmured. "Step aside." Shaq's voice was like steel. "No." And then, sirens. The tension snapped like a rubber band. The two men didn't react, not at first. But then they exchanged a look, a knowing one, a quiet conversation without words. The stocky one sighed, brushing imaginary lint off his sleeve. Not today. They turned, walked away. Just like that. Shaq watched them go, his heartbeat still a steady hammer against his ribs. The black sedan's engine roared to life. The car peeled away from the curb, disappearing into the rush of traffic like it had never been there. Shaq turned back to the girl. She was still frozen, her arms wrapped around her knees, the heels tucked under her chin. 911. The dispatcher's voice crackled from his phone. "Officers are en route." Shaq exhaled slowly. "Yeah, they might want to hurry." The girl still hadn't moved. Shaq crouched, lowering himself to her level. "They ain't coming back. You safe now." Her lips parted, a whisper. So faint he almost didn't catch it. "They always come back." Shaq felt his stomach turn to stone. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Shaq didn't think. He moved. His instincts, sharpened from years of understanding danger without needing it spelled out, took over. The girl was running, and Shaq knew that kind of run. It wasn't just fear. It was survival. The kind of flight that meant someone was after her. He pulled his car to the curb and threw open the door. The city around him didn't care. People walked past, too caught up in their own routines to notice the barefoot girl clutching high heels disappearing into an alley. No one stopped. No one turned. The bus rolled away, its passengers staring at their phones. Shaq's jaw clenched. No one ever looks until it's too late. He stepped onto the sidewalk, scanning the alley. It was narrow, shadowed by towering buildings on both sides. The girl had vanished into the darkness. Shaq moved fast, his long strides eating up the pavement, dodging scattered trash bags and abandoned crates. Somewhere deeper inside, a metal can tipped over. A sharp sound in the silence. Shaq turned the corner, and there she was, crouched behind a dumpster, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She looked up, eyes wide, body tense to bolt again. Shaq lifted both hands, palms up. "Hey, I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't move, didn't blink. She was waiting, waiting for him to grab her, waiting for him to strike. That realization sank into Shaq's bones like ice. What had this girl been through? "You're safe now," he said softly. She flinched. Shaq's chest tightened. He had seen a lot. Poverty, crime, desperation. But there was something about this girl, about the way her tiny frame curled into itself, like she was trying to disappear, that made his stomach twist. Then he saw it. The bracelet. Number, not a bracelet. Shaq crouched lower, his gaze locking onto the black band around her ankle. It was small, almost blending into her skin. A GPS tracker. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just a runaway. She belonged to someone. And they were watching. Shaq inhaled slowly, forcing down the rage bubbling under his skin. He needed to handle this right. He couldn't just grab the girl and haul her to the cops. What if the cops were in on it? He had heard the stories, seen the cases that never got solved because the wrong people had the power. Instead, he softened his voice. "What's your name?" She shook her head fast. "Okay," he said, nodding. "No names. That's cool." She just stared, her grip on the heels so tight her fingers were turning white. Shaq shifted his weight, keeping his movements slow. Controlled. Safe. "You got somewhere to go?" Again, a small shake of the head. He exhaled through his nose. This wasn't going to be easy. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do this another way. You can stay here and wait for whoever put that thing on your ankle to come find you." Her breath hitched. "Or," Shaq continued, "you come with me. Just for a bit. Just until you figure out what's next." Her shoulders were so tight they were practically touching her ears. But she was listening. Shaq saw it, the tiny flicker of hesitation, the conflict. She didn't want to trust him, but she didn't want to be found either. Finally, her grip on the heels loosened. She nodded. Just once. Barely there. But it was enough. Shaq let out a breath. "All right then," he said, pushing to his feet. "Let's go." The diner was small, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, the kind of place Shaq liked because it was quiet, off the radar. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions. The girl sat across from him in the booth, still holding the heels. She hadn't let them go once. Shaq slid a menu toward her. "Pick whatever you want." She didn't move. He studied her, noticing details now that the panic was fading. She was small, her hoodie too big for her, like it had belonged to someone else before her. Her jeans were worn at the knees. She hadn't eaten in a while. Shaq pushed the menu a little closer. "Come on, little sis. Gotta eat." She swallowed hard. "I don't have money." Shaq lifted a brow. "Do I look like I'm asking for it?" She blinked, thrown off by that. Like she wasn't used to people offering something without expecting a price. Slowly, she reached for the menu. Shaq let her take her time. He didn't push, didn't rush. When the waitress came over, the girl barely whispered her order. Shaq added a milkshake to it just in case. She kept glancing at the door, at the windows, waiting for someone to come for her. Shaq saw it all. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That thing on your ankle." She froze. Shaq didn't stop. "Who put it there?" Her hands tightened around the heels again. "Look, I ain't here to scare you," Shaq said, voice even. "I just need to know who we're dealing with." She licked her lips. Thought about it. Then, in a voice so small he barely heard it, she whispered, "They don't like it when we talk." Shaq's spine stiffened. We. Not just her. Others. His stomach twisted. Before he could say anything else, the door swung open. Two men stepped in, both in suits, both looking right at their table. The girl went rigid. Shaq didn't turn his head, didn't react. But he knew. They had found her. And now? Now it was too late to walk away. The air inside the diner felt thick, heavier than it had been just a few minutes ago. The two men who had stepped inside didn't order food, didn't glance at the menu. They weren't there to eat. They were there for her. Shaq didn't turn his head toward them, didn't make any sudden moves. But he felt their presence. His years of reading people, of knowing when danger was close, kicked in hard. These men weren't family, weren't social workers. They had the look of people who had done this before, people who expected to walk in, take what was theirs, and leave without a fight. Nia, because that's what he was calling her now, even if she hadn't said her name yet, sat across from him, frozen. Her hands were tight around the heels, her shoulders hunched so far up they nearly touched her ears. Her silence told him everything. She knew these men. Shaq leaned back in his seat, slow, casual, acting like he wasn't paying them any attention. But his body was coiled tight. The taller man, the one with slicked back hair, made the first move. He took a step forward, but before he could get too close, the waitress, an older woman named Gloria, stopped him. "You need a table, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice sugary but firm. The man hesitated. Shaq could see the flicker of annoyance in his expression before he forced a polite smile. "We're just looking for someone." Shaq's fingers curled into his palms. Gloria didn't budge. "Well, unless you're ordering, you can take your looking outside." Shaq had always liked her. The shorter man, stockier with a scar running down his jawline, exhaled sharply, like they didn't have time for this. He tilted his head, gesturing for his partner to back off. They weren't going to make a move. Not here. Not in public. Not yet. Shaq kept his breathing even as they turned and walked out, but the second the door closed behind them, Nia let out a breath so shaky it nearly collapsed her. She knew they weren't gone for good. Neither did Shaq. They sat in silence until the food came. Shaq hadn't realized how much tension was sitting on his chest until he exhaled, finally reaching for his coffee. Nia, though, she didn't touch her food. Shaq nudged the plate forward. "Go on. You need to eat." She just shook her head. Shaq sighed, setting his cup down. "Look, I don't know what kind of hell you've been through, but you don't gotta be scared of me. I'm just trying to help." Still, she wouldn't look at him. Then, in a voice so soft it almost got lost in the hum of the diner, she said, "If they see you with me, they'll kill you too." "Two." Shaq felt the word like a blade. "How many?" he asked, his voice low. "How many girls like you?" She stiffened. Shaq waited. He had time. Finally, she whispered, "Too many." The milkshake in front of her had started to melt, untouched. She twirled the straw without drinking. Shaq could see it now, the way her hands trembled just slightly, the way her jaw stayed clenched like she was bracing for something. She had learned how to make herself small, how to not be noticed. He had seen this before, not in trafficked kids, but in people who had been through things they never spoke about. War vets, survivors of abuse, people who had learned that talking could get them hurt, or worse. Shaq spoke carefully. "How long you been out?" Her fingers twitched. "Couple weeks," she murmured. "Maybe a month." She didn't know. Because she hadn't been counting days, she'd been counting distance. "How'd you get away?" That got a reaction. A flash of something in her eyes. Guilt. Shaq didn't press. But he saw the truth anyway. Someone had helped her. And now they were gone. Shaq let a few minutes pass before he asked the next question. "That thing on your ankle," he said, glancing at the GPS tracker. "It's still on?" She gave a single shaky nod. That meant whoever had taken her still had a way to track her. Shaq's stomach turned. "What if we cut it off?" Her eyes snapped up, wide with panic. "No." Shaq frowned. "Why not?" "If it stops moving, they'll know." His jaw clenched. He should have known. These people weren't amateurs. Whoever had her was watching. Shaq inhaled slowly. He needed to think, needed to figure this out before those men outside decided to try something more direct. "How deep does this go?" he asked, voice low. Nia gripped the heels again, as if they were the only thing tethering her to this world. Her next word sent a chill through Shaq's chest. "They own cops, too." Shaq went still. She wasn't lying. She wasn't being dramatic. She was warning him. If these people owned the cops, that meant this didn't end with just a rescue. This was bigger. Bigger than her. Bigger than him. Shaq's stomach knotted. This wasn't just about getting her safe. This was about survival. And right now, they were losing. The sun had started to set by the time Shaq threw some bills on the table and led Nia outside. He had expected to see the black sedan still parked across the street. Expected those men to be standing by, waiting. But they were gone. That didn't make him feel better. If anything, it made it worse. Shaq turned to Nia. "You got somewhere safe to go?" She hesitated, which meant no. Shaq exhaled through his nose. He had two options. One, he could drop her off at a shelter or somewhere safe. Someplace where they'd take her in, feed her, give her a bed. But if what she said was true, if these people really did own the cops, they'd find her again. Which left option 2. Shaq ran a hand down his face. He knew it was a bad idea. He also knew he was doing it anyway. "Come on," he muttered, leading her toward his SUV. She stopped. "Where?" Shaq pulled open the passenger door, gesturing for her to get in. "Somewhere they won't find you." Nia hesitated for one long second. Then, finally, she climbed in. Shaq shut the door behind her, checked the street one last time, then got in himself. As he started the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something bigger than himself. And for the first time in a long time, he had no idea how it was going to end. The low hum of the cafe buzzed around them, the clinking of silverware against plates. The quiet chatter of people who had no idea that, just a few feet away, a girl was running for her life. Shaq sat across from Nia in a dimly lit corner, his broad shoulders shielding her from view as best he could. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, but Nia wasn't paying attention to any of it. She had barely spoken since they left the diner, since she had said those 4 words. They own cops, too. Shaq had been in situations before where he had to make quick decisions, where the wrong move could change everything. But this was something else. Nia sat stiff in her seat, her hands still gripping the high heels like they were the last thing tethering her to safety. But she was eating now, and the way she ate, it told Shaq everything. She wasn't tasting the food. She was just getting it down, fast, like she knew it might be taken from her at any second, like she had gone too many nights hungry. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had been around enough kids in rough situations to recognize survival mode when he saw it. He let her eat, let her take her time, because this might be the first meal she had in days. Then, the voice of the news anchor cut through the noise. Shaq wasn't paying attention at first. Just another breaking news segment, just another missing persons report flashing across the screen. Until Nia stopped chewing. Shaq's head snapped up to the TV hanging in the corner. A photo was on the screen. A school picture. Smiling, clean, hopeful. Nia. Missing. 3 months. Shaq's stomach tightened. She stared at the screen, unmoving. Like her worst nightmare had just crawled out from the shadows and sat down beside her. Before Shaq could say anything, before he could think, the door swung open. Shaq didn't have to look to know. He felt it. The shift in the air, the sudden tension. The cafe had been warm a second ago. Now the temperature might as well have dropped. 2 men. Suits. Clean. Expensive. But there was nothing clean about them. They walked in with purpose, like they already knew where she was, like they had been watching. Shaq forced himself to stay still. He took a slow sip of his coffee, keeping his shoulders relaxed, his face unreadable. This wasn't his first time sitting across from a predator. But Nia? She froze. Her hand, the one holding the fork, started shaking. And Shaq? His chest tightened. The taller man spotted her first, smiled. Shaq leaned forward, slow, deliberate. The men walked over, standing just beside their table. They smelled like cologne and something rotten underneath. The one with the slicked-back hair spoke first, his voice smooth like he'd practiced sounding normal, like he wanted people to believe he was just another businessman. "We'll take her from here." Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he said, "Sit down." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was weight in it, a warning, a challenge. Slicked-back hair glanced at his partner, the stockier one with the scar running down his jawline. The scarred man's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't think you understand," Slicked-back said, his fake smile still plastered on. "She's coming with us." Nia pressed herself against the back of the booth, shrinking. Shaq felt his fingers tighten around his coffee mug. He knew these men weren't going to drag her out in public. That wasn't how they operated. They were smarter than that. But that didn't mean they wouldn't make this ugly. Scarjaw finally spoke, his voice lower, colder. "Look, you're a businessman. You get it. This ain't your problem. So why don't you just finish your coffee and we'll be on our way?" Shaq took another slow sip, set the cup down carefully. Then he tilted his head slightly. "You boys follow me here?" he asked, his voice steady. Slicked back laughed. "Come on, Shaq. We know who you are." Shaq's jaw tensed. They weren't pretending now. They had used his name, which meant they weren't just tracking her. They were tracking him. Scarjaw slid a business card across the table. "Take your time, big man," he said. "Think it over." Shaq didn't pick it up, didn't touch it. The men waited. Then, after a moment, they turned and walked out. Nia's hands were shaking. Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to slow. Then, he picked up the business card. There was no name, no company, just a phone number. Nia hadn't spoken since the men left. She just stared at the table, at the untouched food, her breathing shallow. Shaq let a few minutes pass. Let the weight of the moment settle. Then, he leaned forward. "You know who they are?" She nodded once. He already knew the answer. "How high up does this go?" Nia licked her lips. Thought about it. Then, in a voice so flat it scared him, she said, "You don't have enough money to stop them." Shaq's stomach clenched. He had been around millionaires. Billionaires. He had been in rooms with the most powerful men in the country. And yet, this 14-year-old girl was telling him, point blank, that money wasn't enough. "Who do they work for?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not how it works." "What do you mean?" Her fingers curled around the heels again. "There is no who," she said softly. "It's a network. They don't need names. They don't need faces. They just need power. And they have it." Shaq inhaled through his nose, his hands pressing against the table. She wasn't talking about some local criminals running street deals. She was talking about something bigger, something that had been operating in plain sight for years, and Shaq had just stepped into it. They left the cafe out the side entrance. Shaq wasn't taking any chances. He kept Nia close, scanning the streets, his mind running through his next move. She was right about one thing. Money wasn't enough. The cops weren't safe. And the men from earlier, they weren't giving up. As they reached his SUV, he made a decision. "All right," he muttered, opening the door for her. "Time to get some real answers." Nia hesitated before climbing in. Shaq pulled out his phone. He had one last card to play. A friend. Someone who didn't work for the system. Someone who worked against it. As he backed out of the parking lot, Shaq made the call. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Raspy. Wary. "This better be good, Diesel." Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened. "It's bad," he said. "I need to know who's moving girls in this city." A pause. Then, "Meet me in 30. Shaq ended the call. Nia watched him carefully, her eyes searching his face for something. He looked back at her. "You trust me?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, but after a moment, she nodded, and that was all Shaq needed. The tension in the cafe had faded, but Shaq knew better than to think they were safe. Nia sat beside him in the SUV, silent, her eyes darting to the side mirror every few seconds. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't say a word. She just watched. Watched for them. The black sedan, the men in suits. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. He had grown up in tough neighborhoods, been around people who carried power in the wrong ways, men who took because no one could stop them. But this was something deeper. These men weren't just criminals. They were comfortable. They had walked into that cafe like they had done it 100 times before, expecting no one to question them, expecting people to look away like they always did. And that made Shaq's stomach turn. The city blurred past as he drove, his mind racing. He had called in a favor, reaching out to a man who lived outside the system, someone who had seen the cracks in it and learned how to move in the shadows, someone who owed Shaq. 30 minutes later, he pulled into a parking lot behind a rundown auto shop. The sign overhead flickered, the neon barely hanging on. It was the kind of place no one noticed unless they needed something off the books. A man was already waiting. Des Carter, ex-cop, ex-private investigator, ex-a lot of things. Now, he was just a man who knew things no one else did. Shaq stepped out of the car. Naya hesitated, her fingers twitching around the heels still clutched in her lap. Shaq turned to her. You trust me? She didn't answer right away, but eventually, she nodded. That was enough. They walked inside. The air inside the shop smelled like oil and old metal. Des stood by a workbench, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag, eyes sharp as he took in the girl at Shaq's side. Shaq didn't waste time. I need to know who's moving girls in this city. Des tossed the rag onto the counter and sighed. Thought you were done pulling threads that'll get you killed, Diesel. Shaq didn't blink. I don't care about me. Des studied him for a long moment, then flicked his gaze to Nia. She stood still, her body tense, ready to run at any second. Des sighed again, shaking his head. They were in the cafe, weren't they? Shaq's jaw tightened. They walked right up to us. Of course they did. Des grabbed a cigarette from a dented pack, lighting it with a worn Zippo. They don't care about being seen. That's the whole point. No one stops them. Shaq folded his arms, his patience thinning. Who are they? Des took a slow drag, exhaling smoke through his nose before answering. They're not a gang, not a cartel, nothing easy to name. His lips pressed together like he hated even saying the words. They're a network. The kind that owns things. Judges, cops, politicians, people that make problems disappear. Shaq's fists curled. And they're trafficking kids? Des flicked ash onto the concrete floor. Among other things. Shaq felt his stomach churn. He had known it was bad. But this bad? Des exhaled smoke again. I can pull some threads, see what shakes loose. But you need to be careful, Diesel. You're stepping on toes that don't like pressure. Shaq's voice was like steel. Then they can step back. Des smirked, shaking his head. I forgot how stubborn you were. He glanced at Naya. You need to get her off the grid. If they're tracking her, it won't take long for them to show up again. Shaq nodded, already thinking. But before he could say another word, headlights flashed through the shop's dirty window. Shaq turned sharply, his entire body locking up. The sound of tires crunching gravel sent a chill up his spine. Nia's breathing hitched. Shaq didn't have to look to know. They had found them. Des cursed under his breath. Damn it, that was fast. Shaq moved on instinct, placing himself between Nia and the door. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the night. Footsteps. Then, knocking. Shaq didn't move, didn't answer. But Des? He sighed like he was already exhausted. You want this to go sideways, Diesel? Or you want to handle it clean? Shaq's jaw clenched. He wanted a fight. But that wasn't going to help Naya. So he stepped forward, shoulders squared, and pulled the door open. They were waiting. The same two men, slicked back hair and scar jaw. Cool, casual. Like this was just a business meeting. Slicked back smiled. Shaq, I figured we'd find you here. Shaq didn't return the smile. You're wasting your time. The man tisked like Shaq was a child misbehaving. Come on, big man. Let's not make this difficult. Scarjaw stepped forward, tilting his head slightly. His voice was softer, but somehow worse. You think money makes you untouchable? He murmured. We own this city. Shaq felt a slow, deep burn in his chest. Then, without breaking eye contact, he pulled his phone out of his pocket, dialed, held it up to his ear. The taller man's expression twitched. Scarjaw smirked, like he knew what was coming. And sure enough, within 2 minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Flashing lights flooded the lot. 2 squad cars pulled up, uniformed officers stepping out, hands resting on their holsters. Shaq exhaled. Finally, they had backup. One of the cops, a stocky guy in his 40s, walked toward them. His badge glinted in the light. His expression was unreadable. Slicked back didn't look nervous. He didn't look surprised. He just sighed. And that's when Shaq's stomach dropped. The officer turned to him, and he smiled. We got a report about a missing girl. The officer's voice was smooth. You want to tell us why you're keeping her here, Shaq? Shaq's chest tightened. No, this wasn't happening. The cops weren't here to help. They were here for them. And just like that, Shaq knew Nia was right. They did own the cops. Scarjaw smiled, slicked back, adjusted his suit, his posture easy, like he already knew how this was going to play out. The officer gestured toward Nia, who stood half hidden behind Shaq. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you home." Shaq felt her tremble, and that's when something snapped inside him. The next 5 seconds stretched slow, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. Shaq had money, had power, but in that moment, he was just a man standing between a predator and a kid who had no one else. And that made him the most dangerous man in that lot. His voice was calm, steady. "She's not going anywhere." Slicked back exhaled through his nose. "You don't want to do this." Shaq's jaw tightened. "You don't know who I am." Silence. Then finally, Slicked back grinned. And that's when Shaq knew. This wasn't over. This question mark. This was just the beginning. Shaq had been in tough situations before. High-stakes games, billion-dollar deals, cutthroat negotiations. He had faced people who thought power meant controlling everything in their orbit, who believed money made them untouchable. But this was different. This wasn't about business. This was war. And Shaq was already too deep to back out. The night air was thick with humidity as he leaned against the hood of his SUV, staring at his phone. Des had disappeared inside the auto shop, making calls, pulling strings, trying to shake something loose. Shaq had been quiet since the cops left, since they made it crystal clear that they weren't here to help. Nia sat in the passenger seat, knees tucked against her chest, staring out the window. She hadn't spoken in almost an hour, but she didn't need to. Shaq could feel her fear. It was the kind that didn't go away, the kind that settled in your bones. His phone buzzed. He didn't even look before answering. "What do you got?" he asked. Des sighed on the other end. "More bad news." Shaq's jaw tightened. "These guys," Des continued, "they don't just move people. They move everything. Drugs, weapons, information. The trafficking is just one piece of it." A pause. "They're protected, Diesel. Real protected." Shaq had figured that much. "You find a name?" Another pause. Then, "One, but you're not gonna like it." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. "Say it." Des exhaled. "Lawrence Kane." The name hit like a brick to the chest. Shaq knew him, a real estate mogul, a political donor, a philanthropist who owned half the city. And now? Now he was running this nightmare from the top down. Shaq's stomach twisted, because Lawrence Kane wasn't just some rich criminal. He was a man Shaq had shaken hands with. Shaq drove in silence, his mind working through possibilities, options, next moves. But every road led back to the same problem. How do you take down someone who owns everything? His lawyers? Threatened? His contacts? Warned to back off. Even his closest friends. The ones who owed him favors, the ones who always had his back, had suddenly stopped answering calls. One by one, doors were slamming shut. Shaq felt it happening in real time. This was what power looked like. Not loud, not flashy, quiet, controlled, unshakable, until someone shook it. And Shaq? He wasn't walking away. He parked outside a small, nondescript office building, the kind of place you drove past 100 times without ever noticing. No signs, no logos. Just another brick structure tucked between businesses that didn't ask questions. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. A woman sat behind a desk, clicking at a computer. Her hair was in tight braids, her glasses sliding down her nose. She glanced up, gave Shaq a once-over, then sighed. "Turn around, Diesel." Shaq leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "Not happening, Kendra." Kendra Summers, a lawyer who worked in the spaces where the law refused to. She had spent years dealing with cases the cops wouldn't touch, fighting battles the government ignored. And right now, she was Shaq's best shot at finding a crack in Kane's empire. Kendra rubbed her temples. "You really want to get yourself killed over this?" Shaq didn't flinch. "Not if I can help it." She sighed again. "What do you have?" Shaq slid a USB drive across the counter. "Everything I could find on Kane. His properties, his money, his connections." I need something I can use. Kendra hesitated before picking it up. You really don't get how deep this goes, do you? Shaq's voice was calm. Deadly. I do. She held his gaze for a long moment, then finally nodded. Give me an hour. That was all Shaq needed. He stepped outside, taking a breath, the weight of the night pressing against him. Then, his phone buzzed. Shaq pulled it out, expecting Des, expecting an update, expecting anything but what he saw. A message. No name. No number. Just a single photo. Nia. Bound. Gagged. Eyes wide with terror. And beneath it, walk away, or she disappears forever. Shaq's vision blurred with rage. His fingers clenched around the phone so tight that the screen cracked. Every muscle in his body locked up. For a moment, the world faded. No city sounds. No traffic. Just one thought. They took her. Shaq moved before he even processed it, back inside, past Kendra's desk. Her head snapped up. What the hell? Shaq slammed his phone down, the cracked screen still glowing with the message. They have her. Kendra's expression shifted. She grabbed the phone, scanning the message, her face going tight. Then she looked at him. You know what this means, right? Shaq nodded. Kendra inhaled sharply, then grabbed her laptop. Give me 20 minutes. Shaq didn't sit, didn't move. His pulse was a slow, steady drumbeat. He wasn't just angry. He was past that. He was focused. Kane thought money made him untouchable. He thought power meant no one could challenge him. But money wasn't everything. And Shaq had something bigger. He had a name. And he was about to make the world hear it. An hour later, Shaq had everything he needed. Kendra had pulled bank statements, property records, offshore accounts, wire transfers. Kane's entire operation was laid bare. The trafficking, the bribes, the people who kept him protected. Everything. Shaq didn't just have enough to go public. He had enough to bury him. And now? Now it was game on. Shaq made one last call. Des picked up instantly. You got her location? Shaq asked, voice steady. A pause. Then, yeah, I got it. Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Send it. Then he climbed into his SUV, turned the key, and drove into the night. Kane thought he owned the city, thought he owned the law, thought he owned everything. But Shaq was about to teach him a lesson. Some names, they don't get erased. Some names, they bring everything crashing down. And Shaq was about to put a price on Kane's, and it was going to cost him everything. Shaq had never liked the word untouchable. It was the kind of thing men like Lawrence Kane and his people believed about themselves. They sat in penthouses and private clubs, shook hands in back rooms, moved money through accounts that didn't exist. They thought power meant permanence. That no matter what they did, no matter who they hurt, the world would keep turning for them. But tonight the world stopped. And Shaq was about to remind them what happens when the wrong people get noticed. The plan was simple. Kane's people weren't afraid of Shaq. They saw him as a problem, sure, but not a real threat. Because threats had to come from within their world. And Shaq? Shaq was just an outsider, or at least that's what they thought. So he made them an offer, a business proposal, a deal that only a man like Kane would consider. All it took was one phone call. The same men from the cafe, the ones who had walked into that diner like they owned it, took the bait instantly. A private meeting, a new investment opportunity. Big money, no cops, no questions, just business. Shaq gave them the time and place. And then, the real work began. The warehouse was exactly what Shaq expected. Dark, cold, hidden in the outskirts of the city, far enough that no one would hear the screams if they started. Because that's what this place was built for. Not just storage, not just transactions. This was a processing center. A stop before the final sale. Shaq walked in, his footsteps heavy against the concrete floor, his breath slow, steady. He had been in big games before, but never one like this. Because this wasn't about winning. This was about ending it. The men flanking him, scarjaw and slicked back, led him past rows of metal crates, past people who wouldn't make eye contact. Security. Workers. people who were in too deep to question what they were part of. And then, past a rusted gate, into the real nightmare. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't show an ounce of emotion. But what he saw, he'd never forget it. The room was massive. Rows of cages, some small, some larger, all full. Girls, different ages, some young, some older, some not moving, some staring blankly ahead like they had already left their bodies. Shaq's stomach churned, his hands clenching at his sides. Every part of him screamed to end this right now, to tear the place apart, to take these monsters down with his bare hands. But he couldn't. Not yet. Because if he moved too soon, they'd never make it out alive. Lawrence Kane stood in the center of the room. No suit, no press-ready smile. Just a man who had spent his life making sure no one knew his real face. He turned when Shaq entered, grinning like they were just two businessmen talking numbers. "Mr. O'Neill." His voice was calm. "I have to admit, I was surprised by your call." Shaq shrugged, forcing an easy expression. "Money's money." Kane chuckled. "That it is." He gestured around them, as if the room wasn't filled with stolen lives. "Tell me," Kane continued, folding his arms. "What exactly do you want to invest in?" Shaq felt a slow burn in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Show me how it works." Kane's eyes flicked over him, calculating. Then, with a smile, he snapped his fingers. A girl was pulled from a cage. She was young, barely a teenager. Shaq felt his muscles tighten as he watched her get dragged forward, eyes down, shoulders curled in on herself like she had learned how to disappear while still standing. And then, he saw her. Nia. She was in the back, behind the others, her face half hidden in the shadows. But she saw him. And Shaq knew. She understood. Because when their eyes met, for the first time since he had met her, she didn't look scared. She looked ready. And that was all Shaq needed. The signal was already sent. A single tap on his phone before he entered. A silent ping to Des and Kendra, to the people who weren't owned by Kane. People who had spent years waiting for a moment like this. And now? Now they had it. Because in the distance, the sirens started. It happened fast. Too fast for Kane's people to react. The warehouse flooded with flashing lights, the sound of dozens of vehicles pulling up at once. For the first time, Shaq saw it. The moment Kane realized he had lost. It was a flicker, barely there. A tightening of his jaw, a small shift in his stance. But it was there. And Shaq? Shaq smiled. "Looks like your business just crashed." The chaos exploded. Men scrambling, running for exits that were already blocked. Guards pulling weapons only to be tackled to the ground. And Shaq? He was already moving. Straight for Nia. She was struggling with the man who had grabbed her, her body twisting, fighting. Shaq got there first. One quick move. No violence, just force. A grip strong enough to break bones if he wanted to. The man let go. And then, Nia was in his arms. She was breathing hard, her entire body shaking. But she was here. She was safe. And Shaq? For the first time all night, he felt like he could breathe. Kane was still standing when the FBI stormed the warehouse, still holding on to that last shred of power. But when the agents pulled out the documents, Shaq's documents, Kendra's evidence, every single thing that tied him to this nightmare, it was over. The handcuffs clicked shut. And Shaq? Shaq watched him get led away. Because for the first time in decades, Lawrence Kane was walking into a room he wouldn't be able to buy his way out of. And that was worth everything. Hours later, after the dust settled, after the victims were taken into care, after the reporters started swarming the case, Shaq sat on the hood of his SUV, looking out at the city. Nia sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket, sipping a cup of hot chocolate someone had given her. She was quiet for a long time. Then finally she spoke. "You didn't have to come for me." Shaq turned to her, and when he answered, his voice was low. Honest. "Yeah," he said. "I did." She looked at him, her eyes still guarded, still carrying the weight of everything she had been through. But then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. And Shaq? Shaq smiled too. Because the monsters? They were gone. And now? Now it was time to start over. Shaq had seen victories before. He'd watched teams celebrate championships. He'd stood on courts, on podiums, in arenas filled with people cheering his name. But this didn't feel like victory. Because justice, real justice, wasn't a buzzer beater. It wasn't a game with a clear ending. It was a war. A slow, brutal war. And for every Lawrence Kane that went down, there were a dozen more waiting in the shadows, untouched, unseen, still pulling the strings. But tonight one of them fell. And that was a start. The aftermath unraveled like a slow-motion wreck. Kane was gone, arrested, denied bail. The headlines ran his name nonstop, reporters digging into everything. His businesses, his connections, the faces he had hidden behind for years. Some people called it a scandal. Shaq called it the truth finally catching up. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, witness statements, video proof from inside the warehouse. It was enough to tear apart his empire. And yet, Shaq could already hear the doubt creeping in. Would Kane actually serve time? Would the system protect him like it had done for men like him before? Would he walk free in a year, a month, a week? Shaq had spent his life in a world of contracts and negotiations. He knew how power worked, how money moved things behind the scenes. And that's what kept him up, at night. Because this wasn't just about Kane. It was about who protected him, who let this happen, who let Nia happen, and how many more were out there. Nia didn't talk much in the days after. Not about what she'd seen. Not about what she'd survived. She stayed at a safe house, a quiet place far from the city, set up by a private organization that worked outside the system. The kind of people who knew that sometimes, the only way to help someone escape the darkness was to erase them from it entirely. Shaq visited when he could. Not too much, not too little. Just enough. Because he knew that she needed space. Some wounds don't heal fast. Some wounds never heal at all. But every time he came by, he noticed the small changes. The way she sat straighter. The way she started eating meals slower, actually tasting them instead of just forcing them down. The way her fingers finally let go of the high heels. She didn't throw them away. Didn't toss them or burn them, but she stopped carrying them like they were armor. Like she was ready to start being someone else. One night, Shaq showed up later than usual. The air was cool, the wind moving through the trees in a slow, steady hum. Nia was sitting on the porch steps, a blanket draped around her shoulders. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long beat, she asked, "Why'd you help me?" Shaq wasn't sure how to answer at first, not because he didn't know, but because saying it out loud made it real. He exhaled slowly, sitting down beside her. The ground felt solid beneath him. Real. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. Because no one helped my sister. Nia didn't move, didn't blink. But Shaq felt it, the shift in the air, the understanding, because she knew that pain. She didn't ask for details, didn't push for the story. She just let the silence stretch between them. And then, barely above a whisper, "You saved me." Shaq swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the darkened treetops in the distance. He didn't say anything, because he knew it wasn't that simple. Saving someone wasn't just pulling them out of hell, it was making sure they never fell back in, and that fight never ended. The next morning, Nia packed a bag. She was leaving, not because she had to, because she chose to. The organization had arranged everything, a fresh start, a new home, a new identity if she wanted it, a place where no one would know who she was, where she could be someone else, someone free. Shaq stood near the car, watching as she hesitated on the porch steps, looking at him like she wanted to say something. But instead, she just nodded. It was a quiet kind of goodbye, the kind that didn't need words. And then, with one last glance, she got in the car. Shaq watched as it pulled onto the road, disappearing into the distance. He stood there for a long time. Kane was gone. His empire was burning. The system was exposed, raw and ugly for the world to see. But the fight? The fight wasn't over, because Nia wasn't the only one. There were hundreds, thousands. Black girls went missing every day, and the world barely noticed. But Shaq noticed, and he wasn't stopping. Not now, not ever. Because justice wasn't a moment, it was a promise. And Shaq O'Neal, he wasn't breaking it. Not for anyone. Some stories end. This one doesn't. Because Nia isn't the only one. And the fight, it's far from over. Look around. Pay attention. The missing don't stay missing by accident. The question is, what are you going to do about it?